Hey everyone, welcome back. For those of you who are new here, my name is Brittany. I'm a health coach and nutritionist, and my channel is all about helping you to create delicious, low FODMAP meals to improve your digestive health. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. I would really love to hit 100 subscribers by the end of quarantine, whenever that is. All right, so today we are making gluten-free bread. I noticed that everybody has been baking bread lately, you know, being that we're all at home and bored, so I thought this would be a great recipe to give you guys. We're gonna be using Bob's Red Mill 1-to-1 gluten-free baking flour. I like this flour because it's formulated with a blend of different flours to most accurately mimic wheat flour. It also has a bit of xanthan gum in it, which helps to act as a binder. We're also gonna be using psyllium husk, which is the secret to gluten-free bread. It helps to provide your bread with structure and to help trap all the carbon dioxide bubbles that are gonna be made by the yeast. So we are going to be using 1 packet of active dry yeast, some apple cider vinegar, an egg, salt, sugar, olive oil, and water. There are more simple bread recipes with just flour, salt, and water, but I like this one the best. Okay, so we are going to start by putting our yeast and sugar in our bowl and letting it activate. We're gonna use 1 tablespoon of sugar. The yeast is going to eat the sugar, and that's what's going to help it, give it the energy to create all of the carbon dioxide. The most important part of this is activating your yeast. So to do that, you wanna make sure that you're using warm water. I like to go for about 110 degrees. You need the warm water to kind of like melt off the casing around the yeast. Okay, so we're gonna warm up our water. Okay, so we're just going to use a thermometer to check the temperature. I usually find that 30 seconds works well. Yeah, 110 degrees. You can see how often I've done this. Just pour that in, give it a little whisk. And now we're just gonna let it sit for about 10 minutes to let it activate. Okay, so you see all of these little bubbles forming, all this like foam looking stuff. This is what you want. That's what happens when your yeast blooms. It'll also start to smell like bread or like beer, like yeasty, you know? Okay, so our yeast has been activated and bloomed for about 10 minutes. Now we're going to add a tablespoon of psyllium husk. This is going to help it gel. Just gonna whisk that in. Okay, now we're just gonna let that gel for about 5 minutes. Okay, so our yeast and psyllium husk mixture has gelled up quite nicely. You'll see it changes to a bit like thicker of a viscosity than just like plain water. So now we're going to add our flour. I know a lot of recipes will say like, measure your ingredients. Or not measure them, but like weigh them. And I just cannot be bothered to do that. I am just like way too lazy. I don't think that you need to be super precise when you're baking. I think you can just go by how your batter looks and feels. So I just added 3 cups of flour. We're also going to add a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar to neutralize the sugar, an egg, and 3 tablespoons of olive oil. I really like using olive oil because it has such a nice flavor. And don't forget the salt. I've done that a couple of times and the bread just like tastes awful. So we're putting a 1.5 teaspoons of salt. And now we're just gonna mix it up. I have an electric mixer here with a sort of like dough hook thing. But if you don't have one, you can just use the back of a wooden spoon. I've seen people do that. Scrape down the sides. I also like to have a bit of a wetter dough because the moisture content is going to help it rise more easily, which is something that gluten-free bread has a hard time doing because it doesn't have the gluten to help provide it with structure. So I'm just going to add like a splash of water because my dough is looking pretty dry today, and we'll see how it comes out. Okay, so you'll see how it's coming together, but it does need a little bit more of a splash of water. See how it's pulling away from the sides of the bowl? That's exactly what you want. Okay, so at this point, the dough is dry enough that you can remove it from the bowl and roll it out on a surface if you want to make like biscuits or naan or a flatbread or anything like that, pizza dough. I have done that with this same recipe. But to make like a loaf of bread, I like it to be a little bit more wet. So I'm gonna add just a tiny bit more water. It's difficult for me to give you exact measurements for bread because it's highly dependent on the weather. If it's very humid outside, your dough isn't gonna need as much moisture as when it's like really dry out. So you kind of just have to do it and get a feel for it. So the moisture content that I like in my dough for a loaf of bread is where if you were to try to pull this out and put it on the counter, it would totally stick. So that's the kind of moisture content that I like. So that's it for mixing our dough. The great thing about gluten-free bread is that you don't have to knead it because kneading activates the gluten, and if it's gluten-free, you don't really need to do that. So it's so much easier. Now we're just gonna grease our loaf pan. I just have some avocado spray here. Okay, just kind of spread this out evenly. Now we're gonna cut a little slice in the top because it's going to expand and it's going to help it have a more uniform shape when it expands. Okay, now we're just gonna cover it with saran wrap and let it rise for about 30 minutes. If it's cold out, you might wanna let it rise for a whole hour, but it's pretty warm out today. And that's it. Cut. So our dough has been proofing for about a little over 30 minutes. I usually proof mine for about 30 minutes to an hour, depending on the weather and how quickly it rises. You don't want to let it overproof because it will create like big holes in your bread. You just want to make sure that it nearly doubles in size. So now we're just going to put this into the oven at 425. All right, our bread's been cooking in the oven for about an hour. Now we're just going to take it out of the loaf pan and place it directly on the rack to finish cooking. We do this because we want to have like a nice crumb on the outside. You want it to be like crunchy and brown, and you want to let the heat escape and the moisture escape so it's not like soggy on the bottom, which is what can happen a lot of time with bread. Okay, so now we're just gonna put it back in the oven. Okay. We're just gonna put directly on the rack for another 45 minutes. Okay, so this has been cooking for about a total of an hour and 45 minutes. We're just gonna take it out of the oven and place it on a cooling rack. You'll know it's ready when it sounds hollow. All right, guys, our gluten-free bread has been cooling for, I would say, about an hour or so. I usually like to let it cool overnight and then just slice it in the morning. You don't have to like cover it or anything. It's not gonna get stale. I like to wait until it completely cools to cut it, but I'm just gonna, you know, do it a bit early for the sake of the video. But I think that it's similar to meat, how you wanna let it rest before you cut into it because the juices and everything are so hot and they like steam and it makes your chicken dry if you cut it too early. I think it's the same thing with bread. If it's like still steaming, then you're gonna lose moisture. I don't like have any definitive proof on that. That's just how I feel about it. Okay, so you wanna make sure to cut your bread with a serrated knife. It's gonna make it a lot easier. Oh, it's so crunchy. I usually store this in like a Ziploc bag in the fridge because you really don't want your gluten-free bread to go to waste after you went through all this work. All right, well, I'm not gonna slice the rest until it cools down more, but just check out how beautiful that looks. Oh, it's so good. I mean, obviously it's great for sandwiches, avocado toast. It's also great for a garlic bread substitute. If you are eating spaghetti and you're just like, oh, garlic bread would be amazing right now. I suggest getting a little plate and putting some garlic oil in there, some salt and pepper, and maybe even crushed red pepper, and then just dipping this bread into it. You won't even miss garlic bread. You could also add a little balsamic if you feel like it. So one of the questions I get all the time is gluten a FODMAP? And the answer is technically no. Gluten is a protein and FODMAPs are carbohydrates that break down into sugar molecules. But glutinous grains like wheat, barley, and rye are also very high FODMAP. So they just occur together. Now, technically, the serving size for a regular piece of bread, like wheat bread or whatever, it's 1 slice for a low FODMAP, whereas gluten-free bread, you can have 2 slices. So it just kind of makes sense to eat gluten-free bread if you're trying to have a sandwich. It might also be worth just trying to cut out gluten entirely to see if that does help your IBS. I know it did with mine, and it is possible to have a sensitivity to FODMAPs as well as gluten. That's the predicament that I'm in. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope you really try to make this recipe. It's so good, and it's easy, and it's so much better than gluten-free bread like that's in the store. There are a couple of brands that I have found that are good, but the majority of them taste like cardboard. Thank you guys so much for watching, and go ahead and follow me on Instagram. Don't forget to tag me if you make this recipe. I want to see all your guys' bread. Is that weird? All right, guys, thank you so much for watching. See you next week.